Hey there. All right. So today's weekly topic that we're kind of focusing on is now reproduction. Don't be scared. It's not so bad. Basically, what we're getting at is that we know the 7 characteristics of all living things are that one of those characteristics is reproduction, new life. So making new life, and all living things come from pre-existing living things. Life doesn't just come to be, it comes to be through reproduction. We need to understand that all living things reproduce in two ways, okay? One way is what we call asexual reproduction. The other way is sexual reproduction. So there's major differences between the two types of reproduction, and there's benefits, and then there's also disadvantages as well. So we're going to go ahead and explore today what the two types of reproduction are, which kind of organisms reproduce certain ways, and maybe why that would be a benefit, or maybe why that would be a disadvantage for the species. So a few things to note is that when we're talking reproduction, the goal is that it results in offspring. Whether it be asexual or sexual reproduction, always offspring are the end result. And whenever I say offspring, I'm talking babies. Whether it be baby flowers, baby bacteria, or baby people, right? Babies are offspring, so I'll often use that word instead. So let's go ahead and explore some more. Reproduction. So let's talk in particular asexual reproduction. And one of the key components that really defines what asexual reproduction is that we only have one parent. It's not mom and dad, it's just parent. Okay? And so asexual reproduction, that key defining feature, one parent. And so offspring, we're talking babies, are genetically, that means DNA, right? They're genetically identical to the parent. Essentially, they're a clone. They have the exact same DNA if they are reproducing asexually. So when it comes to asexual reproduction, there's 3 different types. You're going to once again record, there we go, this in your journal when it pauses. We have fragmentations, budding, and binary fission. Binary means 2. Fission means splitting. So that means when you have one and it pulls apart to make 2. It's pretty interesting. Fragmentation is when we take a piece off, and budding is when it grows directly off of the original or the parent organism. All right, let's continue. Fragmentation, let's look at this detail, is when a new organism forms from the original. Take a look at these. I'm going to shrink myself up. There we go. How crazy is this? Look at this crazy starfish. So here's what happened, guys. Starfish, if you look at all these pictures, you'll notice these legs are at different sizes. There's a reason for that. If you were to cut off a starfish's leg, they could then regenerate a new leg. Not only that, though, you guys. Not only could they grow a new leg, maybe you've heard of lizards that lose tails and they regrow their tail. Same idea. But this is what stands out that's different about starfish. If you were to chop off their leg and let it sit in a tank where it's not going to get eaten or something out in the wild, the original starfish would in fact grow back that leg, but that little leg would then grow 5 more legs, or 4, or however many it needs for whatever type of starfish it is. So if you look here, this was one adult leg that grew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra legs. How crazy is that? Or this little guy got bit in half pretty much, and he's regrowing his little nubs right there. Those are going to be little legs growing out. And you can also see in this picture the various legs growing off of what was originally there. In fact, these were probably one starfish and they were cut. So another example is a flatworm. Now, can you cut an earthworm in half and get 2? Nope. That's a myth. That doesn't work. If you cut an earthworm in half, it's going to die. Maybe if you cut its tail end off, it might regrow a little bit of the tail, but generally they die. They have hearts, they have digestive organs, they have a brain actually. So if you were to cut off the body from the brain, doesn't work. However, flatworms are so simple. These are things like tapeworms. If your dog has worms and they poop out worms, or your cat, this is what I'm talking about. These are the kind of worms. If you cut them in half, the crazy part is the top half will regrow a back half, and the bottom half will regrow a top half. Oh my gosh. So these guys are never the kind of animals that you want to chop up. If, let's say, you find them in wherever, you go to cut them up to kill them, doesn't work. You're just making a whole lot more of them. So you have to dispose of them in a different way. Okay, so here's another example of fragmentation. Maybe you've done this at home. In fact, I do this a lot with my plants. You can cut, this is a basil. You can cut off a piece of the plant, stick it in some water, and it'll regrow some roots out. The next type of reproduction is budding. So budding is kind of crazy. It's when an organism, a new one, grows out of the parent until it's completely mature, and then it'll break off. So if you look at this picture, you can see that this is a hydra. It's kind of like a jellyfish, and it is starting to grow a little bud right here. And you can see now it's maturing a little bit more until it becomes full size and it breaks away. What? So imagine if that were humans. A little head growing outside of the side of you until eventually pop! Out comes like a full-size human baby. That would be bonkers, right? So a lot of times we see this kind of reproduction in more simple organisms because that would be very difficult to do as the parent. It would take lots of energy. All right, so here's another example of what that picture was of. This is the parent, right? And here's the bud. In fact, you can see the bud is catching a little fish and eating it. So it's eating and consuming and living on its own while still attached to the parent, but it's nearly ready to bust off. Kind of crazy, alien-esque, right? That's real life. Those are organisms that live here on Earth. Okay, so next example we're going to look at is called binary fission. Remember, I said two splitting apart. Fission means to break apart. And it's when an organism copies itself and pulls apart. So my example is bacteria. They're the number one guys that do this. So here's one cell. And you can see that things are changing on the inside. And in fact, what it's doing is making a little nucleus on each side until finally it splits and breaks apart into two separate cells. And in this in particular is how your cells make copies of themselves. So you can't reproduce with binary fission, but your cells do. So when you cut yourself and new skin grows in, that new skin is created through binary fission, through this idea of the cell splitting, eventually being full enough and pulling apart to create two new cells who will then grow to a mature size, because you can see they begin smaller than the adult size there. So our cells do this. However, as humans, we can't pull apart and create two of ourselves. So you can imagine binary fission is really occurring with very simple organisms. Those are the ones that are able to complete this kind of reproduction. Actually, let me jump back. Okay, next up, boy, all my things are messed up. Sorry, guys. This says bacteria. So bacteria reproduce through binary fission, like I just shared. And here's an example of how that might look with bacteria. Also, sea anemones actually reproduce through binary fission. All right, so why is it some organisms would reproduce asexually versus sexually? Well, there's some major advantages to reproducing asexually. Number one, it's really fast. It's a really quick way to repopulate an area. So rapid repopulating. It's easy to reproduce fast and create many offspring. If I can just split and divide, I don't have to go find a partner. It's very, very quick. So that could be an advantage as a species to be able to populate an area very quickly. Another advantage is, like I just said, you don't have to go find a mate. So, no fighting to get that girlfriend or boyfriend. No, looking good to try to get their attention. Actually, when you think about it, a lot of animals have to endure quite a bit to find a mate. Think about I imagine rams. bighorn sheep or rams. They've got the giant horns on their heads, you know what I mean? And they boom, and they bust heads. They'll be climbing up a mountainside, and to fight for dominance to get to the ladies, the boys just butt heads and smash into each other. Same with like elk with their antlers. They fight really hard to get that dominance. And so if you don't have to find a mate, boy, it makes reproduction, making new offspring, so much easier, especially as a whole species. It makes it much easier. So this example explains when in a desolate means there's nothing around, like a desert. When in a desolate environment, there's no need to find a mate. You don't have to go and find another one of you. It's just you. You're good to go. Some other advantages of asexual reproduction is that you can regrow body parts. That's pretty helpful, right? Some plants will create little clones when they don't have any pollen nearby, because believe it or not, plants actually reproduce sexually. They need pollen to fertilize their little eggs, which we call them ovules, and those are like the seeds, okay? So they need pollen, the male cells, to fertilize the little seeds in order for that seed to grow into a plant. So some plants have a built-up backup plan, and that backup plan is that they can create these little clones or these little buds off of themselves when there's no pollen present. So if there's advantages of reproducing asexually, there is also disadvantages we need to address. And so one of those disadvantages is a lack of diversity. And you might not understand what that means, but if you were to look around your classroom and you were to kind of look at every single person, some things you might notice are no two people look the same. Yeah, some of us might look similar, but no two people look the exact same, really, unless you're a clone, and that's like if you're an identical twin or something. We all have slightly different hair color, different texture, slightly different skin tones, different heights is a great example. So when you reproduce asexually, there's no diversity in the population. All the population has the same DNA. They are all exact copies of each other. And why would it be that lack of diversity is a bad thing? Well, it actually does turn out to be a bad thing, because it tends to mean that these organisms seem to go extinct more easily. They're prone to extinction. So if parasites, the example they give right here is parasites or predators come into the area from outside, they can wipe out the population very quickly. If I use a virus, for example, okay, so we could talk about COVID, right? A new virus pops up, and if we apply it to, let's say, a plant, to keep it very simple. Let's say we have a plant, and they're all clones of each other, and this virus attacks a certain part of the plant, and it ends up killing it. It's likely to do that to every single plant it comes in contact with, because they're all the exact same. Whereas you and me, we are genetically diverse. We are very different from each other because we come to be through sexual reproduction. And because of that, because we have this diversity, because no two people are the same, we're not identical looking at our DNA, when we come across viruses, they impact us differently because our DNA is different. That's one reason why some people get very sick from COVID-19, and then others seem to not be much at all. A lot of it has to do with our diversity, right? And sometimes we know what particular diversity is causing the effect. Sometimes we don't. But in a population that reproduces asexually, meaning like binary fission or through budding, where there's only one parent, the offspring is genetically identical, we see that this lack of diversity tends to affect their extinction rates. So along with that is that they can't adapt to their environment. We don't see variations and changes in the population that, let's say it's a drought one year, and maybe they can only handle losing so much water, so they all die off. Whereas plants that maybe reproduce sexually, because remember, plants do reproduce sexually, they're all a little bit genetically different from each other. maybe there's a couple that tend to be a little bit more drought tolerant, meaning they can handle it if it's really, really dry a little bit better than another plant can. And so they might survive, and then they reproduce, and then they have little plants that also can handle drought. And so anyways, when we have asexual reproduction, we find that this adapting to the environment is much more difficult. Okay. So here's my example. Let me shrink my face. Wow. Okay. My example is that genetic variety can exist in a population due to sexual reproduction. So we see that all these little grasshoppers look very much the same, right? So this would be a population where there's a mom and a dad, and they mate and have babies. Okay. Oh, where'd my picture? There it is. So all of a sudden, we have this really hot year. Look, oh, there's a happy sun. We have this really, really hot year, and all the grass dies. If we jump back and look at that previous picture, remember it was all green, so who stood out? These guys stood out, right? They didn't blend in. These guys now blended in. And now we have this drought that comes hold, and the sun kills all the grass, and who blends in now? Well, these guys are nice and camouflaged, but the green guys, they stand out like a sore thumb. So guess what? Little birdie comes down. Who's he going to eat? He's going to eat the little green guys. Don't worry about this weird guy. It's just a random thing from something I stole earlier. So the green guys get picked off easier because they're no longer camouflaged to their environment. So had these little grasshoppers reproduced asexually, meaning they were all genetically identical, they'd all be green, let's say, and their environment drastically changed like that. It was a drought, everything died. Now they're no longer camouflaged. Well, you could see how they're easily picked off from their environment. They're eaten up, and then nothing's left. And there's nothing left to have offspring, and the species goes extinct. So when they reproduce asexually, extinction does seem to be more common. Okay, so let's flip gears. Now we're going to talk about sexual reproduction. I know, don't get scared, it's not so bad. When a species reproduces sexually, you have to have male and female cells. There is always male and female cells. Now listen, some organisms are crazy. Some organisms are both male and female at the same time. Sometimes we get to thinking about the world as we experience it as humans, but when you think about the world and all the living things in it, it's a little more complex and crazy than that. So many earthworms, for example, are both male and female. We call that hermaphroditic. They have male cells and female cells. Every single earthworm can get pregnant. Now, they cannot impregnate themselves, but anytime they find another earthworm, they can mate, and they'll both end up pregnant in the end because they swap male cells and fertilize the eggs that they carry. Another organism I think of off the top of my head is flowers. Can you believe this? Flowers. Flowers are both male and female. They're both. So when we say sexual reproduction, don't get too scared on me. It's actually a little simpler than it might seem. So whole point is male and female cells, and always a mom and a dad, or just male and female cells is really what we're getting at. Those two cells have to come together at some point for fertilization to create new life. So the big thing to take out of this is that when you have sexual reproduction, the babies, the offspring, are not genetically identical to the parents. They simply are not the same. And it's because half of the cells are coming from the mom and half of the cells are coming from dad to create this new life. Whereas in asexual reproduction, it's just a complete copy. So, like I just said, if an organism is produced through sexual reproduction, they're formed from what we call right here haploid cells. So that's the egg and the male cells, and really what they are is they have half the amount of DNA that an organism would need to survive. So when we take one half and we put them together, you get one whole. So you can see why half and half equals one whole. one, right? And so if we have half the information in the egg, half the information in the male cells for new life, for an offspring, and they come together, we then can create a whole new offspring. So when we say haploid cells, it's half the DNA, really. And so cells that have half the chromosomes, let me shrink this up. There we go. Cells that have half the chromosomes, and that's DNA, from mom and then half from dad. Haploid cells, they come together for what I discussed earlier was fertilization. So this is what distinctly makes sexual reproduction very different from asexual reproduction. And so if we're looking at some organisms that reproduce sexually that you might not think about, well, we have chickens, right? It's like this, when you go to the store and you get a little chicken, a little box of eggs, or if you have hens at home and you collect eggs, typically there's no baby growing in there. The egg you buy from the grocery store will never become a little baby chick. It hasn't been fertilized. It's only half of the information an organism needs to survive. It needs the male counterpart. It needed to be fertilized to create a whole organism. So hens lay eggs all the time, like one a day, I think is what it is, just depending. And so if they mate with a rooster, then that egg will become fertilized and have a complete set of DNA to create a little baby chick. And if you look here, and that cute little baby chick. And the way that fish reproduce is kind of interesting. The female will lay her eggs, and then the male will release what's called milt, and it's all of his cells, and then they'll lay on top of the eggs, and that's when they'll become fertilized. And then they'll slowly grow into little baby fish. Some other animals that I think are more typical we think of are like mammals that reproduce sexually. So if you look at these three cubs, at first glance, they all look identical, correct? But wait, if you look a little bit closer and you look at all these little individual spots and dots all over them and the little patterns on their fur, you can actually see each one is unique and individualized from each other. And this is the kind of diversity I'm talking about that happens when organisms reproduce sexually, is that each little organism is going to be completely unique because it's a combination of mom and dad. And because it's a combination, it's not a complete copy of one parent. We have lots of differences among us. So let me jump back to this idea that plants reproduce sexually. So this is a quick breakdown. If we were to cut a flower in half, what you would typically see is that these right here, these little pollen grains, these are the male cells. They're called the stamen right here. And then this is the pistil, which is the female part of the plant. So these little male cells, the pollen grains, they get captured by the wind or little pollinators like this guy right here is a little honeybee who travels from flower to flower. And so he spreads pollen from this plant to this one. It hits the stigma. It comes down the stigma and it'll drill its way down and around and burrow into the ovary. And in here, it will pollinate or fertilize that little bit of cells that are in there, and it'll create seeds that then can be planted and you can grow more plants. Or in an instance of what we experience in the orchards, it'll create a little apple. You can see how it's sexual reproduction because we have male cells, we have female cells that have to come together to create offspring. So why would it be a benefit to reproduce sexually versus asexually? It's like that major component I talked about, genetic diversity. When we're different from each other, as a species, it makes you stronger to changing environments. There's this natural level of disease resistance. It's like this COVID thing I talked about earlier. It doesn't kill everybody, right? Because we're all different from each other. If we had all been the exact same, maybe it could be a lot more deadly. Also, it can lead to these evolutionary advancements. So then why would it be a disadvantage to reproduce sexually for an organism or for a species? Well, typically it takes time, energy, resources just to find a mate. It's like we talked about when I said like the what are these things called? Antlers, right? On an elk, they fight each other, right? To get the right, or a male lion, he fights off the other male lions to have rights to the pride. Or just maybe you live in the bottom of the ocean, which is so expanse, and then here's that word desolate. There's not much around. Just even finding another fish like you is difficult, right? So time, energy, and resources just to find a mate can be a challenge. And here's the other crazy part, it's not always successful. You're not always going to have an offspring if there's mating occurring. And so as a species, that's a drawback for sure for creating new life as a species. And the other crazy part is you can't guarantee the good traits are going to be passed on. And the other offset is that if you're just splitting and dividing, reproduction happens fast and you can have many. It's like that one advantage is that repopulation is really quick. You can make thousands really fast if you're doing binary fission, right? But sexual reproduction, you have less offspring. There's just less that you can have at one time because it takes more energy to grow an organism. All right, so when I talk about time and energy, here's some examples that are kind of interesting. The black alpine salamander is pregnant for 2 to 3 years. Oh my gosh. And they live for 10 to 20 years, but they can be pregnant for 2 to 3 years. That's crazy. Or elephants, they're pregnant for 2 years. In fact, when the babies are born, they're 300 pounds. That's insane. Imagine carrying 300 pounds extra on you. Bonkers. That takes lots of time and energy and resources. Or time, energy in the sense that the male emperor penguin will sit on those eggs for 2 months without any food or water while the mom goes out and gets very, very full and will eventually come back to relieve him of his duties. But that's pretty extreme in really hard temperature.